Daniel had never imagined this day would come. Standing in his small kitchen, phone in hand, he couldn't shake the numbness spreading through him. Just moments ago, he had stumbled upon the text, an innocuous message from a number he didn't recognize, except for the one damning word, tonight. They had been together for nearly 5 years. He thought they were rock solid, the type of couple others envied. They'd shared so many memories, spent countless nights talking about dreams, about starting a family, maybe even leaving their small town for something bigger someday. He couldn't believe this was happening, not to him, not to them. All the little things he had brushed aside. Her late nights out, the unexplained absences, the locked phone, now flooded his mind in painful clarity. Emma walked through the door that evening, and he watched her, silent, as she moved around the kitchen with her usual ease, her smile as warm as ever. The weight of what he knew simmered, anger and disbelief mixing into a painful concoction. He waited until she was washing a dish, her back turned to him, before he cleared his throat, barely able to keep his voice steady as he spoke her name. She turned, looking at him with those familiar eyes, now filled with a curiosity that seemed almost mocking. He took a deep breath and held up his phone. The message still open, its cruel simplicity laid bare. "Who is it, Emma?" he asked, his voice quieter than he'd intended, barely holding back the emotion he'd felt building all evening. She didn't answer right away. Her face shifted from shock to horror to something he could only describe as resignation. She glanced down, her hands trembling as she set the dish down. "Daniel, it's complicated," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He felt his heart pounding, every beat echoing the hurt he had kept hidden. Every unanswered question, every little suspicion now roaring to the surface. He knew, in that moment, she would try to explain, justify, weave words around her betrayal. But he didn't want to hear it. He just wanted the truth. "Who is he?" he asked, each word colder than the last. Finally, she muttered a name, one he recognized instantly, Eric. Eric was one of their mutual friends, a man he'd invited into their home countless times, shared beers with, laughed with. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd imagined, not only from her, but from someone he thought he could trust. The anger was swift, building into a fire he barely controlled as he looked at her, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the stranger standing in front of him. Without another word, Daniel grabbed his keys and left, slamming the door behind him. He walked through the quiet streets, the chill of the evening air sharp against his skin, yet it did nothing to calm him. His mind raced, every memory of the two of them mingling with thoughts of Emma and Eric, his friend, together. Betrayal clawed at him, and a part of him wanted to confront Eric, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain Daniel was experiencing. But something else lingered too, a flicker of something darker, more calculated. He thought of Eric's wife, Jessica, a quiet, kind woman who rarely joined the group gatherings, but was always warm and polite when she did. She had that same trusting look Daniel realized he must have worn every time he looked at Emma. In his anger and grief, an idea began to form, one that surprised even him. He would make Eric feel the betrayal, the shock. He would take Jessica out, not as a date exactly, but as a reminder to Eric and Emma, both that actions had consequences. It was petty, maybe even immature, but right now, it felt like a lifeline, a way to take back some control over the wreckage of his life. The next morning, he waited outside Jessica's workplace, feeling a strange mixture of nerves and anticipation. He had barely spoken to her in all the years he'd known Eric, and now he was here, about to tell her about her husband's infidelity. He wasn't sure how she'd react, if she'd believe him, or if she'd even care to hear it. But as she walked out, her smile bright and unsuspecting, he knew he had to follow through. "Jessica," he called out, his voice softer than he'd intended. She turned, looking at him with surprise and a touch of confusion. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. I need to talk to you. It's about Eric. She looked at him for a moment, her brow furrowing as she took in the expression on his face. Without another word, she nodded, gesturing for him to follow her down the street to a nearby coffee shop. They sat across from each other in silence, and as he watched her, he felt a pang of guilt. Jessica was kind, trusting, maybe even a little naive. She didn't deserve any of this. I don't know how to say this, he began, feeling the weight of his words settle between them. But I found out last night that she's been seeing someone else, and that someone is Eric. Her face fell, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something he recognized all too well. Pain. She looked down, her hand clenched around her coffee cup, her eyes unfocused as she tried to process what he had just told her. I don't know if you suspected anything, he continued gently, but I thought you deserved to know. She shook her head, barely able to meet his gaze. I had no idea, she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric, he's always been distant, but I thought it was just work, stress. I never imagined. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts, their shared pain binding them in a way they hadn't anticipated. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel felt a strange sense of kinship with Jessica. They were both victims of betrayal, both blindsided by the people they loved. He looked at her, sensing the turmoil she was in. And on a whim, he made a decision he hadn't planned on. Jessica, he said softly, I know this sounds strange, but would you consider going out with me? Just for one night. Not as a date, but as a kind of payback. Something to remind them that they don't get to walk away from this without consequences. She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, he thought she'd refuse, that she'd see this as some petty, shallow revenge scheme. But to his surprise, she nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of defiance in her gaze. All right, she whispered, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Let's do it. As they left the coffee shop together, Daniel felt a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with dread. They were stepping into unknown territory, bound by anger, betrayal, and the need for closure. It was a gamble, one that could backfire spectacularly. But in that moment, he didn't care. For once, he was reclaiming his story, taking control of his life in a way he never had before. And as they walked down the street, side by side, he knew that whatever happened next, it would be something neither of them would ever forget. The day after their conversation, Daniel couldn't shake the mix of excitement and dread churning in his stomach. He hadn't expected Jessica to agree to his idea so quickly, hadn't expected that faint, almost mischievous smile she'd given him. Now, as he waited outside the small cafe where they'd agreed to meet, he couldn't help but second-guess his own plan. Was this really the right thing to do? A part of him still couldn't believe he was here, about to follow through with what was essentially a revenge date. But as he watched Jessica walk up, dressed in a dark blue dress that made her look both elegant and subtly defiant, he felt a surge of confidence. They were doing this, and maybe, just maybe, they both needed it. Jessica smiled as she approached, her eyes holding that same spark he'd noticed the day before. Are you ready for this? She asked, her voice calm but tinged with a nervous energy. Daniel nodded, offering her his arm in a playful gesture. Ready as I'll ever be. Let's give them something to talk about. They started with dinner at a nice restaurant on the edge of town. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other's business, the kind of place Emma and Eric were likely to frequent. They made their entrance together, arm in arm, both aware of the subtle glances and raised eyebrows around them. As they were seated, Daniel caught a few familiar faces from around town, people he and Emma had known for years. He felt the weight of their curiosity, the silent questions swirling around him. The fact that he was out with Jessica, of all people, would spread like wildfire. Jessica noticed it too. She leaned across the table, lowering her voice with a grin. They're practically staring holes into us. Do you think they figured it out?" Daniel chuckled, feeling an unexpected lightness in his chest. "They don't have to. The town thrives on rumors. By morning, the story will have evolved into a full-blown scandal." For the first time in days, he felt himself relaxing. Sitting here with Jessica, sharing in this strange, rebellious act, he felt a camaraderie he hadn't expected. As the night went on, they traded stories, laughing and venting over the small absurdities that had somehow led them to this moment. Jessica had a quick wit and a surprising sense of humor, and Daniel found himself genuinely enjoying her company. They weren't just two people nursing wounds from betrayal. They were two people who understood each other in a way no one else could. But just when he thought the night would be smooth sailing, the first twist came. Halfway through their meal, Daniel glanced toward the entrance, only to see Eric himself walk in, arm around Emma. Daniel's heart stuttered, a surge of anger mixing with a touch of panic. Emma's eyes locked onto his, widening as she took in the sight of him and Jessica sitting together. For a moment, he could see the surprise in her expression, the realization that she wasn't the only one who could play this game. Jessica noticed too. She glanced from Daniel to the couple near the door, her smile tightening. "Well," she said softly, "I guess this is where things get interesting." Daniel gave her a small nod, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. It was more for his own reassurance than anything, but he saw the faint gratitude in her eyes. She squeezed back, her gaze steady as she turned her attention back to her meal, pretending not to notice Emma and Eric watching them. But ignoring them was easier said than done. Emma, clearly flustered, led Eric to a table near the back, her movements stiff and forced. Daniel could almost feel her gaze burning into his back, and he struggled to focus on Jessica's voice, trying to drown out the mix of anger and satisfaction simmering inside him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emma broke. She stood, abandoning her meal as she stormed over to their table, her face flushed with anger and perhaps a hint of jealousy. Jessica tensed, her hand tightening around her fork as Emma loomed over them, eyes blazing. "So this is what you're doing now, Daniel?" Emma spat, her voice low but laced with fury. "Dragging Jessica into your petty revenge." Daniel met her gaze, his own anger flaring as he leaned back, keeping his voice calm. "I think you lost the right to question what I do after you decided to lie to me. And Jessica's here of her own choice. Unlike some people, we don't keep secrets." Jessica's gaze hardened, and she straightened in her seat, speaking for the first time since Emma approached. "You have no right to speak to him like that, Emma. After everything you and Eric have done, I'd say you are the last person who gets to be angry here." Emma faltered, momentarily caught off guard by Jessica's calm defiance. She looked between them, her expression shifting from anger to something resembling shame, though it was quickly replaced by cold disdain. "You don't know anything about our relationship," she said, her voice venomous, "or what's between Eric and me." Jessica's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her tone icy. "I know enough to see that you've hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And if you think this is going to end well for you, you're sorely mistaken." For a moment, Daniel thought Emma might snap, might escalate the situation in front of everyone. But then she scoffed, giving him one last glare before she turned on her heel, striding back to her table with a dignity that rang hollow. Jessica watched her go, her expression thoughtful. "I never thought I'd see the day she'd be put in her place," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Daniel nodded, a sense of satisfaction mingling with the lingering bitterness in his chest. "I didn't think it would feel this cathartic. Maybe this was the closure we needed." The night ended on a quieter note, the confrontation with Emma casting a subtle shadow over their dinner. But as they left the restaurant together, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace. He hadn't expected this evening to go the way it had, hadn't expected Jessica to stand by him so firmly. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, he felt like he was starting to move on, like he had a sense of control over his own life again. They walked through the streets, the cool night air wrapping around them as they made their way to Jessica's car. She stopped by her door, turning to face him with a thoughtful expression. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly, "for letting me be part of this. It helped more than I thought it would." He smiled, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. "Thank you for going along with it. I don't think I could have faced them alone." They shared a quiet moment, each lost in their own thoughts, their shared pain and defiance hanging between them. Finally, Jessica took a deep breath, giving him a small, brave smile. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Jessica." As she drove away, Daniel stood alone on the sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear down the street. He felt the weight of everything that had happened settling over him, the strange relief that came from facing his past head-on. He wasn't entirely healed, but tonight had been a start, a step toward rebuilding the life that Emma and Eric had tried to destroy. But as he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Emma wasn't the type to let things go, and something told him that tonight's events would set off a chain reaction, one he couldn't predict or control. For now, though, he took solace in the small victory he and Jessica had achieved, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, there was still strength to be found in solidarity. As he reached his door, he glanced back down the street, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, Daniel awoke with a strange sense of calm, something he hadn't felt in days. As he replayed the events of the night before, he realized he didn't regret anything about his choice. Seeing Emma's reaction, the shock on her face, and the defiance in Jessica's eyes had brought a sort of satisfaction he hadn't anticipated. Yet, despite the calm, there was an undercurrent of tension, an uneasy feeling that this wasn't over. Emma was unlikely to let the situation rest. She wasn't the type to accept things quietly, and the thought lingered in Daniel's mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Later that day, as he walked through town, he noticed the stares and heard snippets of hushed conversations. The rumor mill had gone into overdrive, and by now, everyone in town must have heard about the spectacle that had unfolded at the restaurant. He could feel eyes following him, curious glances from people who were undoubtedly piecing together the story based on what they had heard. It was a small town, and stories like these never stayed buried. He stopped by a local coffee shop, hoping to escape the whispers and judgmental stares. Just as he was taking a seat, his phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see a message from Jessica. "Lunch," it read, followed by a small smiley face. He couldn't help but smile, replying with a quick, "Sure, see you in 20." When Jessica arrived, she looked more relaxed than he'd ever seen her, a quiet confidence radiating from her as she joined him at the table. She clearly heard some of the rumors too, but rather than appearing shaken, she seemed almost amused by the attention. "So it looks like we've become the town's latest scandal," she said with a smirk, glancing around the cafe at a few people who were clearly watching them. "Seems that way," Daniel replied, unable to hide his grin. "Can't say I'm surprised, though. Small-town drama is practically a pastime here." Jessica laughed, her eyes sparkling with a mischief he hadn't noticed before. "Well, if they're going to talk, we might as well give them something to talk about." They spent the next hour chatting and laughing, the ease between them growing as they shared stories of life in the town, their frustrations, and dreams they'd almost forgotten. Jessica's humor was dry and unfiltered, her stories tinged with a wisdom and resilience he admired. She had a knack for cutting through the nonsense and saying things that others might shy away from. With her, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection and understanding that ran deeper than he'd realized. But as they were leaving, another unexpected twist came. Just as they stepped outside, they were met with the unmistakable figure of Eric, who stood by his car across the street. His expression was dark, his jaw clenched, and as he locked eyes with Daniel, a sneer twisted his face. Jessica's hand tensed around her purse, but she stayed silent, standing firm by Daniel's side. Daniel felt his own temper flare as Eric sauntered over, clearly unbothered by the public setting. A few passers-by slowed down, Sensing the tension in the air, their curiosity piqued as they watched the unfolding drama. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Eric drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he looked between the two of them. "Couldn't even wait a week, could you, Daniel?" Daniel met his gaze calmly, refusing to let Eric's words get under his skin. "Funny coming from you," he replied, his voice steady. "Seems like you're the expert at not waiting." Eric's sneer faltered for a second, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, though it was still loud enough for Jessica and anyone nearby to hear. "You think you can just stroll around with my wife and act like you've won something? You're nothing, Daniel. You always have been." Daniel felt Jessica's hand touch his arm, a subtle reminder to keep his composure. She didn't need to say anything. Her steady presence was enough to keep him grounded. He took a breath, his eyes never leaving Eric's. "Maybe I am nothing to you," he said slowly, "but I got enough self-respect to know that what you did was wrong. I thought you were my friend, Eric. But now you're just someone I used to know." Eric laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Self-respect? Don't kid yourself. You're just bitter because you couldn't keep her interested. Maybe if you weren't so dull, Emma wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." Jessica's face hardened, and before Daniel could reply, she stepped forward, her voice calm but laced with quiet fury. "Enough, Eric. This isn't about who's more interesting or who's to blame. It's about the fact that you lied, that you betrayed the people who trusted you. So don't stand here acting like you're the victim." Eric's face turned red, his expression twisting into something venomous. "Stay out of this, Jessica. This is between me and Daniel." "Oh, it stopped being between the two of you the second you involved me," she shot back, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not just going to sit back and let you drag him down with your pathetic excuses." A few people nearby muttered in surprise, clearly caught off guard by Jessica's sudden assertiveness. Eric's eyes narrowed, and he looked around, noticing the attention they were drawing. He glared at Daniel one last time before turning on his heel, his footsteps heavy as he stormed back to his car. As he drove off, the silence settled over them like a thick blanket, the weight of the confrontation sinking in. Jessica let out a breath, her hand dropping from Daniel's arm as she glanced up at him. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice softer. "I didn't mean to get so involved. I just couldn't stand the way he was talking to you." Daniel smiled, a genuine warmth filling him as he looked at her. "Don't apologize. I'm glad you did. I think he needed to hear it." They stood in silence for a moment, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly ebbing away. Around them, people continued to whisper, casting glances their way. But Daniel found he didn't care. For once, he felt like he'd stood up for himself, like he'd faced the man who had wronged him without backing down. And Jessica had been right there with him, strong and unwavering. As they walked down the street, a few more people stopped to greet them, offering nods of support and even a few smiles. It was clear that word had spread fast, and to his surprise, the town seemed to be taking his side. He hadn't realized how much support he had, and the realization brought a new sense of strength he hadn't expected. They ended up at a small park on the edge of town, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Jessica leaned back, closing her eyes as she let the cool breeze wash over her, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Do you ever wonder," she began, her voice quiet, "how things might have turned out if none of this had happened?" Daniel thought about it, letting her question sink in. He imagined a life where he and Emma had stayed together, where they'd continued living in quiet ignorance. But as he looked at Jessica, he realized that, strange as it sounded, he wouldn't trade the path he was on now. It had brought him here, to this moment, to the person sitting beside him. "I think we'd still be stuck in the same place, just a little more miserable each day," he replied, his voice soft but certain. "And maybe that's what all this was about, forcing us to see things as they really are, even if it hurts." Jessica opened her eyes, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "I think you're right," she said quietly. Maybe this is our chance to find something better." They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thought, the weight of their shared experiences binding them in ways they hadn't anticipated. And as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Daniel felt a strange sense of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself since Emma's betrayal. Their quiet moment was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. Daniel looked up to see a familiar face, Mr. Albright, the town's oldest resident, and something of a local historian. He was known for his wisdom and was one of the few people who seemed to know everyone's business without judgment. Mr. Albright nodded to them, his gaze kind yet knowing. "I heard about what happened last night," he said in his gentle, gravelly voice, "and I just want to say, sometimes standing up for yourself means you're on the right path, even if it doesn't feel like it right away." Daniel felt a lump in his throat as he nodded, the old man's words resonating with a truth he hadn't fully grasped until now. "Thank you," he replied softly. "It means a lot." Mr. Albright gave a small smile, tipping his hat before continuing down the path, leaving them once again in the peaceful quiet of the park. Daniel glanced over at Jessica, who was watching him with a newfound warmth, her smile soft and genuine. For the first time since it all began, he felt like he was finally moving forward, finally finding peace. And as they sat together in the fading light, he knew that no matter what happened next, the next few days passed in a blur for Daniel. But he felt an undeniable shift in himself. There was a new steadiness in his steps, a quiet resolve he hadn't felt in a long time. People in town continued to talk, but their tones had softened, and he was surprised to find genuine support in unexpected places. Jessica had become something of an ally, someone who understood what he was going through. And while they hadn't planned another outing, they exchanged messages here and there, checking in on each other. But he should have known it wouldn't be that easy, not with Emma. True to her nature, she wasn't ready to let things go, and it wasn't long before her anger found its way back into his life. It started subtly, petty things like the cold stares she gave him in public or the occasional rude comment thrown his way. But soon, her bitterness took a more deliberate form. One afternoon, as Daniel walked into his usual coffee shop, he found a few people whispering, their eyes darting toward him with a mixture of pity and judgment he hadn't seen before. When he finally approached the counter, the barista, a friend of his from high school, gave him a sympathetic look. "I don't know if you heard, but Emma's been talking," she said cautiously, handing him his coffee. "Talking about what?" Daniel asked, already feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "She's saying things about you and Jessica, things that make it sound like you two have been involved for a long time, like you're the one who started all this." Daniel clenched his jaw, feeling a familiar anger simmering beneath the surface. Emma knew exactly how to turn the narrative, spinning it in her favor to make herself look like the victim. And by dragging Jessica into her lies, she was attacking the only friendship he had left from this mess. He could almost hear Emma's smug tone in his mind, the way she'd twist her words to make everyone believe what she wanted them to believe. After leaving the coffee shop, he found himself dialing Jessica's number, feeling a mixture of anger and frustration. She answered on the third ring, her voice as calm and collected as ever. "Daniel, what's up?" she asked. "Emma's spreading rumors about us," he replied bluntly, unable to keep the irritation from his voice. "She's saying that you and I were together before any of this happened, trying to paint herself as the one who was wronged." There was a brief silence on the line. Then Jessica let out a deep sigh. "I had a feeling she'd do something like this. She's not one to go down without a fight." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, guilt washing over him. "I never meant for any of this to drag you down. Maybe I should have thought this through more carefully." "Don't apologize," Jessica replied firmly. "I knew what I was getting into. And if she wants to play dirty, that's on her. Besides, I'm not exactly one to back down either." Her words were steady and strong, and Daniel felt a flicker of pride in her resilience. Jessica was no stranger to facing adversity, and she'd never let anyone define her. They decided to meet up later that evening. just to talk things over in person and figure out their next steps. They met at a quiet spot near the edge of town, a little overlook that offered a view of the valley below. As they sat on a weathered wooden bench, Jessica stared out at the darkening sky, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said after a while, "I spent a lot of time feeling like I had to be quiet, to not stir up trouble. Eric always had a way of making me feel like I was too much, like I had to shrink myself to fit into his life. But now I'm tired of shrinking." Daniel looked at her, seeing a fire in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. "You don't have to shrink for anyone, Jessica, least of all her." She met his gaze, a small smile forming on her lips. "Then maybe it's time we gave her something real to talk about. I don't want to play her games, but I also don't want her to think she can push us around." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Jessica's smile widened, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Let's take control of the story. If she wants to make us out as the villains, let's lean into it, on our terms. Let's go out in public, make it clear that we're not hiding or ashamed. Maybe if she sees we're unbothered, she'll realize she's lost her power over us." The idea was bold, almost reckless, but Daniel felt a surge of excitement. He wasn't one to seek attention, but he'd spent so long letting other people shape his life that the thought of taking charge, of owning his story, felt liberating. They agreed to meet the next evening at the town square, a spot where locals often gathered, where they would be seen, where Emma would inevitably find out. The next evening, Daniel found himself standing at the square, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Jessica arrived shortly after, looking confident and poised, a quiet strength radiating from her. As they began walking together, arm in arm, they could feel the eyes of those around them. Some curious, some judgmental, but all intrigued. They exchanged small smiles, both knowing they were challenging the narrative Emma had tried to create. It wasn't long before Emma herself showed up, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. She marched up to them, barely able to contain her anger as she addressed them both, her voice tight and venomous. "Really, Daniel? Parading around with her like this? Have you no shame?" Daniel looked at her, calm and unflinching. "Shame? I think you're the one who should feel that. You lied, you betrayed me, and now you're trying to tear us down because we're not willing to let you control us anymore." Jessica stepped forward, her voice steady and cold. "Emma, you can spread as many rumors as you want, but the truth has a way of coming out. And the truth is, you hurt people who trusted you. That's on you, not us." Emma's face twisted with rage, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think anyone here will take your side? You're nothing but the rebound, Jessica. No one's going to believe you." But as she spoke, Daniel noticed a few people nearby shaking their heads, clearly unimpressed with her display. A few others exchanged glances, muttering quietly, and Daniel realized with a sense of satisfaction that Emma's attempts to rally people against them were failing. They weren't the ones who had betrayed anyone, and the people around them were beginning to see that. Emma, realizing her hold on the situation was slipping, turned on her heel and stormed off, her steps heavy with defeat. Jessica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a small smile of relief breaking through. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel and Jessica found themselves alone once more, a quiet sense of victory settling over them. For the first time, Daniel felt like he was truly free, free from Emma's manipulation, free from the fear of judgment, free to start his life anew. Jessica looked at him, her eyes warm and grateful. "Thank you, Daniel. I don't think I could have faced her alone." He reached out, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You didn't have to. We're in this together." They walked away from the square, side by side, knowing they had taken back control of their lives. And as they headed toward an uncertain future, they both felt an undeniable sense of strength. A strength born from facing the past head-on, from refusing to be defined by anyone else's narrative. In that quiet moment, Daniel understood that his life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd lost something, yes, but he'd gained something far more valuable: the courage to stand up for himself and the hope for a future free from the shadows of betrayal. And as he walked beside Jessica, he felt a certainty he hadn't felt in years, that whatever happened next, he was ready. The days after their public stand were some of the most peaceful Daniel had known in years. He felt the freedom that came from finally breaking free from Emma's influence, and every step he took felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of secrets and betrayal. It wasn't that the town had stopped talking. Far from it. But this time, the whispers seemed to carry a different tone, a newfound respect that Daniel hadn't expected. People who had once looked at him with curiosity or judgment now nodded at him in quiet solidarity. He could sense that he and Jessica had won over the community, simply by standing firm and refusing to be drawn into Emma's games. Jessica seemed to feel it too. They met often, mostly for coffee or to chat in the park, and with each meeting, Daniel noticed how much lighter she seemed. She laughed more easily, her smile broader and more genuine than it had been when they first reconnected. They shared quiet moments together, talking about everything from their jobs to childhood memories, and in each conversation, Daniel felt a warmth he hadn't anticipated, a growing closeness that made him wonder if this strange twist of fate had actually been a gift. One evening, as they sat by the park watching the sun set over the horizon, Jessica turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I used to think I'd never get out from under Eric's shadow. He made me feel so small, like everything I did wasn't quite good enough. But now I feel like I'm finally finding myself." Daniel smiled, watching her as she spoke. He could see the change in her, the way her confidence had blossomed since that night at the restaurant. She no longer carried the weight of betrayal on her shoulders, and the transformation was as inspiring as it was humbling. "I'm glad you're finding that, Jessica. You deserve to be seen for who you really are," he replied, his voice genuine. "You don't need anyone to tell you who you should be. You're stronger than you know." She met his gaze, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. "You know, Daniel, I don't think I'd have come this far without you. You've been more than a friend through all this, more than I could have asked for." He felt a warmth spread through him at her words, but before he could reply, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the park, shattering the peaceful moment. It was Eric, and from the way he strode toward them, it was clear he wasn't here to apologize. His face was twisted in anger, and there was a barely concealed fury in his eyes as he stopped a few steps away from them. "So this is it, huh?" Eric sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just going to keep flaunting this, whatever this is, in front of everyone. You're making fools of yourselves." Daniel stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Jessica as he faced Eric. He was done hiding, done letting Eric dictate how he felt. "This isn't about you, Eric. It never was, Jessica, and I don't owe you any explanations, and frankly, we don't care what you think anymore." Eric's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're the hero here, Daniel. You think anyone respects you. You're just the guy who couldn't keep his girl. That's all you'll ever be." Jessica stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "No, Eric. That's what you wanted him to be. But that's not who he is. He's the one who had the courage to stand up to you, to refuse to be treated like he was nothing. He's not the one who needs to be ashamed here." Her words seemed to sting, and Daniel saw the flicker of doubt in Eric's eyes. But Eric quickly masked it with a mocking laugh, shaking his head. "You really think you can just move on and act like none of this matters? You're both delusional." Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself before he replied. "We're not acting like it doesn't matter, Eric. It matters, but it doesn't define us. What you did hurt, but we're moving forward. That's something you clearly don't understand." For a moment, it looked like Eric might say more, that he might lash out in some desperate attempt to regain control. But instead, he let out a frustrated sigh and stormed off, his shoulders tense, his footsteps echoing through the park as he disappeared into the distance. Daniel watched him go, a strange sense of finality settling over him. He realized that this was the closure he hadn't known he needed, the chance to stand face to face with the person who had wronged him and walk away unbroken. Jessica turned to him, her expression a mixture of relief and pride. "I can't believe he's still trying to hold on to control," she murmured, shaking her head. "But I guess some people never change." Daniel nodded, feeling the sense of peace wash over him. "Maybe not, but we don't have to let him control us. We've already taken back our lives, and he knows it. That's why he's so angry." They sat back down on the bench, the tension gradually fading as they watched the sun dip below the horizon. There was a new silence between them now, not the strained silence of unspoken pain, but a quiet understanding, a sense of shared victory. They'd faced their past, confronted the people who had wronged them, and come out on the other side stronger. As the last light faded from the sky, Daniel felt Jessica's hand slip into his, her fingers warm against his palm. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, he realized that what had begun as a strange twist of fate had turned into something much deeper. He wasn't sure what lay ahead for them, but he knew he wanted to find out, with her by his side. The next morning, Daniel woke with a newfound sense of purpose. He knew that he and Jessica needed to start thinking about what came next. They couldn't just keep meeting in secret corners of the town or ducking into quiet coffee shops. They had faced down their past, but it was time to decide what their future would look like. They met for breakfast at a diner on the outskirts of town, a place where they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew. As they sat across from each other, Daniel felt a sense of anticipation, like he was standing on the edge of something important. Jessica sipped her coffee, looking thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through," she said finally, her gaze fixed on him. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to face it alone." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Neither do I. Whatever comes next, I want us to face it together." They spent the morning talking, dreaming up ideas for their future. Jessica mentioned wanting to start her own business, maybe a small art studio where she could finally explore her creativity without Eric's shadow hanging over her. Daniel shared his own dreams, ideas he had shelved for years while he'd been with Emma, plans he'd thought would never come to life. They laughed, plotted, and dared to imagine a life beyond the confines of the small town that had once defined them. By the time they finished breakfast, they both felt a sense of excitement, a renewed belief that they could build something real together. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Jessica continued to carve out their new life. They'd moved in together, finding a small apartment on the edge of town where they could start fresh, away from the judgment and expectations of their past lives. They worked side by side, supporting each other's dreams, growing closer with each passing day. There were challenges, of course, moments of doubt, the occasional harsh word from someone who couldn't let go of the past. But each time, they faced it together, stronger for the journey they had taken. One evening, months after that fateful night at the restaurant, Daniel found himself standing on their balcony, looking out at the town below. Jessica joined him, slipping her arms around his waist as they stood together in the fading light. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if we hadn't gone through all this?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. He turned to her, smiling as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes, but I don't regret any of it. It led me to you, and that's worth more than anything I could have imagined." They stood in silence, letting the peace of the evening wash over them. They had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, but they had emerged stronger, bound by a love that had grown from the ashes of their pasts. And as they held each other, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The journey had been painful, and the scars would always be there. But those scars were a testament to their resilience, a reminder of the strength they had found in each other. And in the quiet embrace of the night, Daniel knew that he had finally found his home, one he would never have to leave. Months turned into a year, and Daniel and Jessica's life together blossomed beyond what either of them could have ever envisioned during those dark, tumultuous days. They had built a sanctuary, not only in their small apartment, but also in each other's unwavering presence. The journey had been rocky, and they'd faced judgment, gossip, and even moments of doubt. Yet every obstacle had only strengthened their bond. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and together they had learned to find peace within that imperfection. Jessica's dream of opening her own art studio became a reality. She'd converted an old, abandoned building on the edge of town into a warm, inviting space where artists and locals alike could gather, express themselves, and connect. The walls were filled with paintings, sculptures, and creations from local artists, each piece telling a story, much like her own. The studio quickly became a staple in the community, a space where people felt free to be themselves, to share their creativity, and to find solace in art. Daniel was immensely proud of her. He spent his evenings at the studio, often helping with repairs, painting walls, or simply spending time with Jessica as she worked. In the beginning, he'd felt like a visitor in her world, but slowly he found his own way to contribute. Inspired by Jessica's courage, he began working with local youth groups, organizing workshops to teach young people the skills he'd learned over the years: carpentry, repairs, and even some basic mechanics. It was a humble role, but one that gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known he needed. Their relationship became a pillar within the town. People who had once doubted them, those who had whispered rumors and raised skeptical eyebrows, began to see the genuine love they shared. They were a testament to resilience and growth, a reminder that it was possible to rebuild after being torn apart. And slowly, the community embraced them, no longer as a scandal, but as a symbol of strength. One evening, as they were closing up the studio, Daniel noticed Jessica staring thoughtfully at one of her paintings, a beautiful, haunting image of a broken vase pieced back together, its cracks filled with gold paint. She had painted it months ago, but he could see that tonight it held a different meaning for her. "Thinking about something?" he asked, coming up beside her. She looked up at him with a soft smile. "It's just funny, isn't it? How something that feels so broken can become more beautiful when you take the time to repair it. I guess I never imagined we'd end up here." Daniel nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "Neither did I. But maybe that's the beauty of it. We found something stronger than what we lost." Jessica took his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "Do you ever think about Emma? About everything she put us through?" He sighed, glancing away for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. "I think I used to feel angry, but now I just feel grateful. She pushed us to face things we never would have otherwise. If it hadn't been for her, I don't think either of us would have found ourselves, let alone each other." Jessica nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had both been forced to confront the parts of themselves they'd buried, the vulnerabilities and insecurities that had held them back. Emma had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited the fire of transformation within them. And now, standing together in the studio they'd built from the ground up, they both knew that they were better for it. Their moment was interrupted by the chime of the studio door. Jessica turned, surprised to see an older woman standing there, looking a little uncertain. She was one of the town's longtime residents, a woman who had often avoided them in the early days of their relationship. But tonight, there was a warmth in her eyes as she approached. "Jessica Daniel," she began, her voice soft but sincere. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you've brought to this town. This studio, the work you do with the young people, it's changed things. It's brought us all closer, and it's made me see things differently. I'm sorry if I ever doubted you." Jessica reached out, gently squeezing the woman's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the woman left, Daniel and Jessica shared a quiet smile, both feeling the impact of her words. It was moments like these that reminded them of the difference they'd made, of the lives they had touched simply by staying true to themselves. Later that night, as they walked home together beneath the starlit sky, Daniel felt a peace he'd never known before. Their path had been winding, filled with challenges, but it had led them somewhere beautiful. They had not only built a life for themselves, but had also become a part of something larger, a community that had grown to accept them, even celebrate them. When they reached their apartment, Jessica stopped him just outside the door, her gaze steady and warm. "Daniel, there's something I want to ask you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his heart beating a little faster. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, a smile breaking across her face as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small worn envelope. "I know it's not traditional, but will you marry me?" For a moment, Daniel was speechless. He looked down at the envelope in her hand, then back at her, feeling a rush of emotion so strong it nearly took his breath away. He had never expected this, never imagined that the woman who had once been just a friend's wife would become the love of his life. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. 1,000 times, yes. They laughed, both of them a little teary-eyed, and he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as the reality of their commitment settled over them. They had found each other in the ashes of betrayal, had built something real from the ruins, and now they were ready to face the future together. The wedding was a simple, beautiful affair held in the heart of Jessica's studio, surrounded by friends, family, and the very community that had once doubted them. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate speeches, only the quiet, heartfelt vows they spoke to each other, promises made under the glow of candlelight and surrounded by the art that had become a testament to their journey. As they exchanged rings, Daniel felt the weight of their shared history lift, replaced by a hope, and a love that was as enduring as it was fierce. He looked into Jessica's eyes, seeing a reflection of the strength and resilience they had built together. And he knew, without a doubt, that they would weather anything life threw their way. That night, as they danced together under the stars, Daniel realized that their love had been forged through fire, tempered by pain, and shaped by forgiveness. They had transformed something broken into something whole, something that neither betrayal nor hardship could tarnish. Years passed, and Daniel and Jessica's life together continued to grow and flourish. They expanded the studio, welcoming more artists, more young people, and even started a mentorship program to give back to the community that had eventually embraced them. Their story became one of resilience, of turning hardship into strength, and as they grew older, they took pride in the legacy they had created, a legacy that had started from a place of pain but had blossomed into a life of love and purpose. In the quiet moments, they would sometimes look back, reflecting on how far they had come. But they never dwelled in the past. Instead, they used it as a reminder of their journey, of the path they had walked to find each other. And as they watched the next generation take their places in the studio, Daniel and Jessica knew that they had found their true home, not just in each other, but in the community they had built. Their love, like the art they cherished, was timeless, etched with scars, perhaps, but beautiful all the same. And they lived each day with gratitude, knowing that they had turned betrayal into belonging, heartbreak into hope, and against all odds, they had crafted a life that was truly their own.